I'm certainly not going to do a long speech or a lecture, because I think your introduction makes it very clear how wide-ranging the topic is. It's actually very difficult to define what it actually is that we're talking about. So that makes it equally difficult to define, what policies apply, what policy questions or challenges we have. So I'm just going to meander a little bit through a couple of different issues relating to financial services and personal data, in the widest sense of the word. I think, and I want to focus maybe a little bit on the question whether data protection rules and data and privacy rules are actually restricting innovation and enterprise. I obviously do not believe that that is the case. But I know that that is a fear in business, that data protection rules are actually hampering innovation and enterprise. I think one of the key words maybe in that respect is trust. I've been working on issues of data protection for about 12 years now. And about 12 years ago, most people thought that, I was a crazy MEP focusing on a niche topic that nobody was interested in. I was otherwise harmless, but it wasn't particularly relevant. But I think today everybody recognizes the relevance of privacy protection and the protection of personal data. And there are a lot of misunderstandings about what that means. The protection of privacy does not mean that you cannot have access to any information on people's private lives. That's not what it means. But it does mean what impact does it have on the life of the data subject? And indeed, the question you raised, who is the owner? Because the protection of privacy also means the protection of, for example, equal treatment. It means the protection of freedom of speech. It means the protection of consumer choice, which is relevant to today's panel. So it means a lot more than just the protection of the private life of a person. There's so much that's connected with it. And as people are becoming more aware of the impact that data processing and risks to privacy may have on their lives, they're also becoming more critical towards companies, organizations that are using their personal data. And I think if you look at the reactions of big companies to all kinds of revelations about how big companies were sharing personal data with secret services, for example, they were very quick to make it clear to their users that, we don't want to do this anymore. We are going to protect your personal data. We're going to protect your privacy. Now, whether they actually do so in reality is not very relevant. But the fact that they considered it very important to convince their customers, their users, that their data were safe with them is, I think, telling. I don't think any company that wants to have a commercial future these days is going to say, privacy is irrelevant. Everybody will want their customers to trust them, and therefore I do think data protection and privacy protection are important issues, and not just from the, let's say, the ethical perspective. I think we also have to look at what kind. I mean, when we talk about data protection, we're talking about very different things, or very different uses that can be made of data. It can be simply the processing of the personal data of an individual in the context of a particular service provided to that individual, a contract between the company and the individual. It could also be big data, as you say. But what's big data? For example, when data are anonymous, they're not considered to be personal data, and they don't fall in the scope of the data protection legislation. I think that's quite important to realize. Although today, with today's technologies, it's not so easy to really anonymize data anymore. So, there are more and more data captured by the data protection regulation, but still it's important to realize that anonymous data are not personal data and therefore not in the scope of the data protection regulation. But say that they're not anonymized, they may be fully identifiable or pseudonymized even. And then you ask the question, in the case of big data, who owns the data? Well, I think it is my interpretation, I'm not a lawyer, but on the basis of the existing data protection rules, or rather the data protection rules that will kick in 2018, it's still what we call the data subject. The fact that your data are in a huge, massive set of data doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're not the owner of that data anymore. And I think we will have to come up with innovative ways of dealing with that reality. I think the distinction is also relevant because simply processing individual data for purposes of identifying a person and holding records on that person, which have to do with the service, is different from using big data, because then we talk about personal data as behavioral data, revealing something about person's behavior, their choices, their preferences. And that goes actually further than mere analysis. Increasingly, we are moving into the area where those data are being used to predict people's behavior. Now, this is all more or less foreseen in the data protection regulation. When there is talk in Article 22, for those of you who are interested, about profiling and automated decisions. And I think it's very important to realize that on the one hand, of course, it's fascinating to use big data in order to make profiles and predict people's behavior, or maybe categorize them in a certain way. At the same time, you have to realize that people are always entitled to human intervention. And I think any of us present in this room can understand that. And certainly when you're talking about financial services, I think everybody will understand that you don't want to be excluded, for example, from a particular financial service because a computer has decided that on the basis of your profile you're not considered to be creditworthy. Just giving a simple example, it could also be something else. So you're always entitled to human intervention, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think it's also important, again, in the context of trust. If you want your customers to trust you, then you have to make it very clear to them that that you're also offering them that service. I think another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about competition. I've also seen some examples in practice, and we were talking about it just when we were having our sandwiches here, how the use of personal data can provide a competitive advantage, but making reference to data protection rules has proven to be a competitive advantage in practice as well, whereby big incumbents, banks in this case, use data protection rules as a justification for not sharing personal data with other providers of financial services, saying, oh no, we cannot possibly share the data of our customers, even if those customers have specifically given consent to the providers of the other financial services to use their personal data. So when you ask who are the owners of the data, that's not a relevant question only in the context of big data, but also in the context of individual cases. Another aspect linking competitiveness or competition rules and data protection is that from 2018 onwards, from the time that the regulation will be applied, all providers who provide services from outside the European Union, but they are targeting EU citizens, will still have to comply with EU rules. And that's a big difference, or at least a clarification compared to the current situation. And I think if we in Europe are smart, and if we anticipate the entry into force of the regulation, and if we prepare for it, then we actually do have a competitive advantage, because providers from outside Europe will also have to comply with the same rules. Now, of course, I'm not saying that they are not anticipating this, but still, I think it's something to keep in mind. Well, I think the final remark I just want to make is that if you look at what the data protection rules in the European Union, what they actually regulate, it's not nearly as bad as some people from the business community sometimes fear. It's often seen as something that's very restrictive. But I actually think it offers us great opportunities, because it gives you an opportunity to establish that relationship of trust with your customer. And your customers will claim that protection anyway. And I think, and we see that companies who are now actually offering services that are privacy friendly, they have a competitive advantage. It's not just regulation. Regulation is just, let's say, consolidating what people want, and it gives them a legal protection. But I do think that that it will actually help us innovate. And of course, there will be rules which are hampering certain activities, but that's the case in a democracy. There are lots of rules that limit what we can do, and for very good reasons. And I think that in Europe we have always proven that we are extremely smart, and we can always innovate our way around it and make sure that we improve our products, and that we are not unduly restricted. So I do think that when you talk about the future of financial services and the sky is the limit, I think we cannot even begin to imagine what is possible. But I do think data protection rules and privacy protection are actually going to be helpful and not an obstacle. Thank you.